When a homeless kid shouted, "Don't eat that," no one could have predicted what would happen next. The Park Cafe was a magnet for the city's elite. Nestled between rows of manicured trees and the soothing hum of a nearby fountain, it buzzed with life in the midday sun. Waiters in crisp uniforms weaved gracefully between tables, balancing trays of artisanal dishes and freshly brewed coffee. The air was rich with the aroma of warm bread and the faint sweetness of blooming flowers. But for one man, none of this seemed remarkable. At a prime table in the center sat Bernard Green, a name synonymous with power and wealth. He had built his empire from scratch, starting with real estate in his 20s and expanding into ventures few could even dream of. At 72, Bernard carried himself with the confidence of someone who owned not just his world, but perhaps everyone else's as well. His sharp suit and gold-rimmed glasses reflected a life of opulence. Yet, as he glanced at the menu, his movements were slow, almost hesitant. Opposite him sat Marissa, his much younger wife, a woman who looked as though she had stepped straight off a magazine cover. Her jet-black hair framed an impossibly polished face, her bright red lipstick carefully applied. Every inch of her radiated elegance, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She absent-mindedly twirled a diamond bracelet on her wrist, her attention fixed not on her husband, but on her phone screen. Nearby, a boy lingered just beyond the patio fence. Small for his age, his oversized hoodie hung loosely on his thin frame. His dark eyes darted from table to table, scanning plates and pockets, searching for an opportunity. His name was Malik, though no one at the cafe knew him. His face was a familiar sight on this street. A kid with nowhere to go, always on the outskirts of conversations and the edges of concern. Bernard glanced at his watch. "You're distracted again," he said, his voice calm but pointed. Marissa looked up and offered a sweet smile, though it lacked warmth. "I'm right here," she replied, reaching across the table to place her hand on his. "You know how much I enjoy these lunches." Malik's stomach growled as he edged closer, his footsteps almost silent. He leaned against the patio railing, his eyes fixed on Bernard's table. The meal before the man was the kind Malik hadn't seen up close in months. A pristine white bowl of soup, fresh bread, and a glass of sparkling water. But then something unusual happened. As Bernard adjusted his glasses and picked up his phone, Marissa's hand slipped into her designer handbag. Malik watched her fingers close around a small vial. With a casual flick, she twisted it open, tilting her hand ever so slightly over the steaming bowl. The liquid disappeared into the soup in an instant, blending seamlessly. Malik froze, his breath catching. He watched as Marissa stirred the soup with the spoon, her expression unchanged. Then, she leaned closer to Bernard, her voice low but audible. "After all the trouble I've gone through, you won't ruin this now." Malik blinked, unsure of what he had just witnessed. Was this real? Could a woman so poised, in a place so polished, really be doing something so sinister? His instincts screamed that something was very wrong. His heart pounded as he crouched lower behind the railing. No one else had noticed. No one else had been paying attention. It was just him. The faint growl in his stomach tried to pull him away, but his eyes stayed locked on the couple. Bernard looked tired, distracted, his spoon hovering over the bowl as he checked his phone. Marissa, once again all charm, smiled brightly and rested her chin on her hand, as if nothing had happened. Malik clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He wasn't sure what he'd just seen, but the chill in her voice haunted him. He glanced around at the other patrons, laughter, chatter, clinking glasses. No one cared. No one even noticed him. But his gaze returned to Bernard's spoon, now dipping into the soup. Malik's chest tightened. He had seen her pour something into it. He knew what would happen if the old man took a bite. His thoughts raced. He didn't know Bernard, but that didn't matter. Right was right, and wrong was wrong. The moment stretched endlessly. Then, without thinking, Malik pushed himself off the railing and marched straight to the table. His legs felt heavy, but his feet didn't stop. His voice cracked as he shouted, "Don't eat that!" Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The clatter of a dropped fork echoed across the cafe. Bernard froze, his spoon inches from his lips, his wide eyes locking onto the boy. Marissa whipped her head around, her expression hardening. "What did you just say?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Malik didn't falter. His voice was shaky but loud enough for everyone to hear. "She put something in your food. I saw her. Don't eat it." Gasps rippled through the cafe as every patron turned toward the scene. The suffocating silence was broken only by Malik's heaving breaths, adrenaline surging through him. Bernard blinked, glancing between the boy and his wife. "Marissa," he said, his tone calm but his trembling hand setting the spoon down. "What is he talking about?" Marissa's composure snapped like a rubber band stretched too thin. She shot to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the stone floor. "You little liar," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "How dare you accuse me of something so vile? Who even let you in here?" The words stung, but Malik didn't back down. His eyes stayed locked on Bernard's, desperate to make him see the truth. "I saw her. She poured something into your soup when you weren't looking," he said, his voice steadying as he spoke. "You can smell it if you don't believe me." Bernard's face paled as he turned toward his wife, his eyes narrowing. "Marissa, what's going on?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. She scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "He's just trying to cause trouble. Look at him. He probably just wants money or food." She spat, the words as venomous as her glare. Her disdainful gaze flicked to Malik, but the boy didn't waver. He stepped closer to the table, his fists clenched. "I'm not lying," he said firmly, his voice rising. "She doesn't want you to know, but I saw everything." Bernard's hand lingered over the bowl, torn between disbelief and a gnawing doubt creeping into his mind. Something in the boy's tone made him hesitate. The air around the table thickened, the lively cafe now eerily silent. All eyes were locked on the unfolding drama, meals forgotten. Leaning back slightly in his chair, Bernard studied Malik with a scrutinizing gaze. His face bore the marks of a man accustomed to manipulation and schemes aimed at his wealth. But this was different. The boy didn't flinch, didn't look away. "Malik, is it?" Bernard asked, his voice steady, though a trace of suspicion lingered. The boy nodded. "Yes, I'm telling the truth. Please, don't eat it," he said, his voice soft but insistent. Marissa let out a harsh laugh, crossing her arms as she glared at Malik. "This is absurd," she snapped, her tone icy. "He's just some street kid looking for attention. Are you really going to entertain this nonsense, Bernard?" But Bernard didn't answer her. Instead, he picked up the spoon again, this time holding it closer to his face. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the quiet storm brewing within him. "Marissa," he said slowly, his eyes locking onto hers, "you heard him. What exactly is going on here?" Marissa's mask of poise cracked further, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I can't believe you're even asking me that. It's insulting," she snapped. Her voice rose as she turned to the growing crowd. "He's lying. Look at him. He probably doesn't even know who you are. Why would you trust him over me?" The weight of her words hung in the air, but they didn't have the effect she'd hoped for. The murmurs began, soft at first, then louder. Did she really do it? "Look at her. She seems nervous. That boy doesn't look like he's making this up." The whispers only fueled Marissa's fury. She slammed her hands on the table, her polished demeanor now completely gone. "Enough of this, Bernard. Eat your damn soup and let's go," she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. But Malik wasn't backing down. He took another step forward, his fists clenched tightly. "If you won't believe me, then call someone to test it," he said, his voice rising with urgency. "You're rich. You've got lawyers, doctors, people who can figure it out. But don't eat it. If you do, you'll regret it." Bernard's jaw tightened as he turned back to the bowl. The spoon was still in his hand, but he didn't lift it to his lips. His eyes, tired and calculating, shifted to his wife. "Marissa," he said, his voice low, "you've been acting strange for weeks now. This—" Her face flushed, and she stumbled over her words. I don't know what you're talking about. You can't seriously think I'd poison." "Me," Bernard finished for her, his tone razor-sharp. The crowd gasped audibly, their whispers growing louder. Malik stood firm, his gaze unwavering. His heart pounded, but he wouldn't let it show. He'd done what he could. Now it was up to Bernard. Marissa straightened, her expression hardening into something cold and unfamiliar. "This is ridiculous. I don't have to sit here and listen to this nonsense," she said, grabbing her hand back. But before she could leave, Bernard's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with surprising strength. "You're not going anywhere," he said firmly. "Not until we get to the bottom of this." The waiter, who had been frozen in place, finally found his voice. "Sir, should I call the police?" The question sent a ripple through the cafe, and for the first time, Marissa looked genuinely panicked. She shook her head violently. "Don't you dare. This is just a misunderstanding. Bernard, you can't seriously." "Call them," Bernard said, raising a hand to silence her. He didn't even look at the waiter as he spoke. Malik felt a surge of relief, but it was fleeting. The truth wasn't out yet, and the tension was far from over. The cafe held its collective breath as the waiter hurried inside to make the call. Bernard released Marissa's wrist, his eyes never leaving hers. The once polished charm she wore so effortlessly had unraveled, replaced by growing desperation. She glanced around, her lips moving soundlessly as though searching for an escape. Meanwhile, Malik stepped back, his hands trembling slightly. He'd done all he could, but doubt crept into his mind. What if Bernard didn't believe him? What if she managed to talk her way out of this? Malik clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay rooted in place. "Malik," Bernard said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You said you saw her put something in the soup. Can you describe it?" The boy nodded quickly and stepped forward. It was a small bottle, like one you'd use for medicine. Clear liquid. She poured it in while you were looking at your phone, then stirred it. "I swear I saw it." Bernard's face tightened as he turned to Marissa, whose head was already shaking vehemently. "This is absurd. He's lying. Why would I?" But Bernard cut her off sharply. Why would he lie? What could he possibly gain from this? The cafe erupted into murmurs again, the rising tension now mingled with the sound of approaching sirens. Marissa's eyes darted toward the soup, and for a brief second, her carefully constructed mask slipped. She looked cornered. Desperate, she turned on Malik. "You've been spying on us, haven't you? Trying to cause trouble because you're jealous of people who actually have something." The accusation hit Malik like a slap, but he held his ground. "I'm not jealous," he said firmly. "I saw what I saw, and I couldn't just stand there and let you hurt him." The sirens grew louder, and soon 2 police officers entered the cafe. The room seemed to shrink as they approached the table, their hands resting on their belts. "What's going on here?" one of them asked, his tone calm but authoritative. Bernard stood, his commanding presence undiminished despite the turmoil. "Officers, I need you to take a look at this," he said, gesturing to the bowl of soup. "This boy claims my wife poisoned it." The officers exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. One leaned down, sniffing the bowl cautiously, before turning to Marissa. "Ma'am, do you have anything to say about this?" Her face turned crimson. "This is ridiculous. He's just a street kid trying to cause trouble. Bernard, are you really going to let this nonsense go this far?" The officer didn't budge. "We'll need to test the contents," he said, reaching for the bowl. "No," Marissa snapped, her voice rising. The outburst drew even more attention, and her sudden panic made her guilt seem undeniable. The officer paused, narrowing his eyes. "Ma'am, is there something you'd like to tell us before we proceed?" Marissa hesitated, her chest heaving as she clutched her hand back. Her gaze darted between Bernard and the officers, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Finally, her composure crumbled. "Fine," she spat, her voice low and venomous. "You want the truth? I'm tired of living in his shadow, tired of his control over everything. He was never supposed to make it past this year, and I—" She stopped abruptly, realizing too late the gravity of her confession. The cafe erupted in collective gasps. Some patrons pulled out their phones to record the scene, while others whispered in disbelief. Bernard's face drained of color as her words sank in like a knife. His composure cracked, his hands trembling as he pushed the bowl away. The officer stepped forward, his expression grim. "Ma'am, I'm placing you under arrest for attempted murder. Please put your hands where I can see them," Marissa screamed, thrashing as the officers secured her hands behind her back. "You don't understand. I deserved everything he had. Everything," she shouted, her voice echoing through the cafe as she was led away. Bernard sank back into his chair, staring blankly at the table. Disbelief and betrayal etched deep lines into his face. For a moment, he said nothing. Then his gaze shifted to Malik, who stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. Bernard's eyes softened, and a flicker of gratitude replaced the shock. Malik hadn't just saved his life. He'd revealed a truth Bernard might never have seen. As the cafe slowly returned to a low hum of whispers, Bernard gestured to the seat across from him. "Malik," he said softly, "sit." Malik hesitated, glancing nervously at the onlookers. But Bernard's voice carried a weight that compelled him to obey. He lowered himself into the chair, his shoulders tense. "You saved my life," Bernard said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I don't know how I can ever repay you." Malik fidgeted, gripping the edge of the table. I couldn't let it happen," he said quietly. "I couldn't just watch and say nothing." Bernard nodded, his gaze distant as if replaying the ordeal in his mind. "Most people would have," he said after a pause. "They would have turned the other way, pretended they didn't see. But you didn't. That took courage." Malik shrugged, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't like seeing people get hurt. That's all." Bernard leaned back, studying Malik for the first time. Not just as a scrappy street kid, but as someone with a story and a soul. "How long have you been out here?" Malik looked away, his voice tinged with embarrassment. "A while." Bernard frowned but didn't press. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a sleek black phone. "Wait here," he said, stepping away to make a call. Malik's heart pounded. Was Bernard going to have him removed? Was he in trouble? But when Bernard returned, his expression was calm, almost kind. "Help is on the way," Bernard said simply. "Help?" Malik asked, his brow furrowing. Bernard nodded. "I called someone I trust. They'll make sure you have a place to sleep tonight. Somewhere safe. And if you'll let me, I'd like to do more than that." Malik's eyes widened. "You don't have to do that," he said quickly, his voice defensive. "I didn't do this for money or anything," Malik said, his voice low but resolute. Bernard smiled faintly, a warmth flickering in his tired eyes. "I know. That's exactly why I want to help you. You did something most people wouldn't have, and trust me, Malik, if the world had more people like you, it would be a much better place." For the first time in a long while, Malik felt a warmth he couldn't quite describe, a flicker of something he thought he'd lost forever. He looked down, unsure of what to say. The cafe patrons began to disperse, but the weight of what had happened lingered in the air like an unspoken lesson. Bernard picked up his glass of water, taking a slow sip before speaking again. "Sometimes life gives us the chance to change someone else's story," he said, his voice thoughtful. "You changed mine today, Malik. And maybe, just maybe, I can help change yours." Malik glanced up, his dark eyes glistening with something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. As the two sat in silence, the sun continued its arc across the sky, casting long shadows over the cafe. Though the chaos had subsided, the memory of what transpired remained etched in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. The lesson wasn't lost on them. Courage doesn't always wear a suit, and kindness doesn't always come from the wealthy. Sometimes, it's the people we overlook who possess the greatest strength of all. In the end, Malik's bravery didn't just save a life. It reminded everyone in that cafe of the power of standing up for what's right, no matter the odds. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us for more tales of courage, truth, and redemption. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder that even the smallest actions can create life-changing impacts.